In 1974, on the 30th of March, 16 stalls selling crafts, antiques and handmade jewellery opened in a derelict builder's yard beside a canal lock in North London, on ground so blighted by a cancelled motorway scheme that the last 7 years of the lease had just changed hands for £10,000, because 7 years was reckoned to be all the land was worth. 51 years later, in 2025, that same stretch of canal frontage went up for sale as a single estate valued at £1.5 billion, collecting roughly £72 million a year in rent from the stalls still trading on it. Camden Market now draws somewhere between 27 and 30 million visitors a year, the fourth most visited site in London. £10,000 for the ground back when nobody wanted it, £1.5 billion for what stands on it now, £72 million a year in rent, collected from the trade of people who made the ground worth collecting rent on in the first place. Nobody who signed that first lease thought they were buying into an asset. They thought they were renting a stall in a yard nobody else wanted on a Saturday. For as long as it lasted, it lasted. The traders did not. This is the story of a market that was permitted to exist only because a motorway had made the land worthless, and of the 50 years it took to reverse that arithmetic completely. Chapter 1. A junction, not a destination. Camden Town, in the years before any market existed there, was not a place anyone chose to stay. It was a junction, the exact point where the road running north out of London crossed the Regent's Canal, and the logic of the district for the first century of its history followed entirely from that one intersection. The canal came first, and for a reason that had nothing to do with Camden itself. Where the older Grand Junction Canal ended among the warehouses of Paddington, engineers surveyed a route east that would carry coal, timber and grain past Camden, down through Islington and Hackney, to the docks at Limehouse and the tidal reach of the Thames. Construction crawled through years of stalled funding, the way canal construction generally did in that period, and the section through Camden was finished well before the rest of the route. By 1816, water was moving through the Camden cutting. By 1820, the canal ran unbroken from Paddington to Limehouse, joining the Thames to the inland waterway network of England in one continuous channel. Camden sat on a slope in that channel, and the canal's builders solved the slope the way canal builders always solved a slope, with a double lock, 2 chambers lifting loaded barges 8 feet before releasing them onward toward the city. None of it was built for Camden's benefit. The lock, the towpath, the warehouses that rose along the banks after the water arrived, all of it existed to move cargo through the district as efficiently as possible, the way a pipe is built to move water, and a pipe does not accumulate a population. For 2 decades, Camden functioned exactly as designed. Coal barges idled at the lock gates. Boatmen worked the paddles and the balance beams. The town remained a scatter of fields and market gardens on London's northern edge, notable chiefly for the water running through it. Then, in 1836, the calculation changed. Robert Stephenson was a Northumberland-born engineer, son of the railway pioneer George Stephenson, who had grown up around the collieries of Wylam and Killingworth before proving, with the rocket in 1829, that a locomotive could outrun anything else on rails. By his early 30s, Stephenson was chief engineer of the London and Birmingham Railway, tasked with building the first main line to reach the capital from the industrial north, and the hardest of his decisions was where that railway would end. He chose Camden, not Euston, a mile further south where the passenger terminus would eventually rise with its declared columned grandeur. Camden, for the goods traffic that carried the railway's real revenue. The choice took shape between 1837 and 1839, and it rested on arithmetic as plain as the lock itself. Freight arriving by rail at Camden could be swung directly onto barges on the Regent's Canal, and from there continue without another mile of road haulage straight into the enclosed docks of London. The Regent's Canal Company had made sure of that outcome. Years before Stephenson's surveyors reached the site, the company had secured a condition binding on any railway crossing its line. Goods traffic would go no further into London than the edge of the water, whether toward Euston, the city, or the docks themselves. The condition shaped everything that followed at Camden. The railway could not simply run its freight trains through the site and onward toward the river. The trains had to stop here, and the cargo, coal or timber or manufactured goods bound for export, had to be unloaded from one carrier and loaded onto another, by hand, at the single point where rail met water, and neither could go any further without the other. The goods depot opened in 1839, built into the rising ground above the lock, a complex of transshipment sheds, turntables and vaulted undercrofts designed for one purpose, to keep cargo moving between two systems that had never been built to meet. Nothing about the design assumed permanence, it assumed volume, and volume only. Wagons came down the incline on cable, goods were sorted and swapped from truck to barge inside the vaults, and the labour that made the transfer possible ran on a form of power that had nothing to do with steam. Beneath the sidings, stalls were already being fitted for horses. 50 of them at first. Chapter 2. The Animals and the Engines. The depot that opened in 1839 was not built for people. It was built for weight, and weight in 1839 still moved on 4 legs. Beneath the railway sidings, where the trains came to a stop and the cargo changed hands, the engineers had cut a set of brick vaults into the ground and fitted them with stalls for 50 horses. Every sack, crate and barrel that a locomotive carried into Camden had to leave the depot the same way it had arrived anywhere else in London for the previous 1,000 years, on a cart, behind an animal, through a street too narrow for anything larger. The horses were not an afterthought to the railway. They were the last mile of it. 50 stalls did not stay 50 for long. Freight through the depot grew faster than anyone in 1839 had planned for, and by 1849 the yard was running 427 horses, not resting in the vaults but working them in relays around the clock. Horses hauled the wagons up the incline from the goods shed, out through the gates and along the streets to the warehouses and shop fronts the railway itself could never reach, then stood harnessed in the tunnels under the tracks, waiting their turn, while the next locomotive came in overhead and the next load was already being counted onto the platform. A depot, built to move goods by rail, had become, underground, one of the largest working stables in England. Picture the top of the incline on a weekday morning in 1849. The air smells of coal smoke from the sheds and, underneath it, of the stable yard itself, straw and animal and wet brick. A team leans into its collars and a loaded wagon starts to move. Iron-shod hooves striking sparks on the stone sets. The driver walking alongside with a hand on the nearest bridle. Behind that wagon another is already being hitched. The line does not stop because the trains upstairs do not stop, and every wagon that comes down off the railway has to go somewhere a locomotive cannot follow. It was simply how a city fed itself before the combustion engine, 427 times over on this one stretch of ground. The tunnels, the ramps and the stalls cut for those animals were not temporary structures. They were built into the depot's foundations, and the foundations did not change even after the horses that filled them were gone. The vaults where grooms once slept between shifts, the ramps built to a gradient a horse could climb with a loaded cart behind it, the brick arches sized for a stable door rather than a shop front, all of it survives underneath the market today. It is the part still called the stables, and the people who walk through it now, past the clothing rails and the coffee stands, are walking through the same tunnels that 427 horses once worked in shifts to keep a railway moving. The engines needed a home of their own. Between 1846 and 1847, beside the depot, the London and Birmingham Railway raised the Great Circular Engine House, a round brick building designed so that locomotives could be turned on a central turntable and serviced in the surrounding bays, one machine to a stall in a building shaped like a stable for iron horses instead of live ones. It survives today as one of the oldest engine sheds left standing in Britain, known ever since as the Roundhouse. It did not survive as an engine shed for long. The locomotives it had been built to hold grew too large for its turntable and too heavy for its bays within a little over a decade, and the building was left without a working purpose. For roughly the next 100 years, it did what disused industrial buildings along that stretch of canal always ended up doing. It became a warehouse, and its longest tenant was a gin distiller, Gilbey's, whose barrels sat under that circular roof for decades while the freight yard outside kept working. The freight kept working, but not forever. The wagons still needed horses, the horses still needed the vaults, and the whole arrangement still needed cargo to move through it in growing volume year after year. That was about to stop being true. Chapter 3. The Long Emptying. That was about to stop being true, and it stopped slowly over the better part of a century in the way that industrial decline generally arrives, not as an event but as a subtraction, repeated until the thing being subtracted from no longer resembles what it was. The canal went first. Through the early decades of the 20th century, road haulage took over the short journeys that barges had always handled better than anything else, moving goods from a depot to a warehouse a mile away without the trouble of a lock or a towpath or a horse team waiting its turn. The Regent's Canal at Camden did not close. It simply carried less. Fewer barges queued at the double lock. Fewer boatmen worked the paddles. The traffic that had justified the lock, the depot, the entire arrangement of vaults and sidings above it, thinned out year by year until thinning became the ordinary condition of the place. The goods yards followed the canal down the same slope for the same reason. Rail freight, which had displaced the pack horse and outlasted the barge, was itself displaced in turn by the lorry, and the depot Robert Stevenson had cited for its connection to the water lost the argument that had built it in the first place. Sidings that had once run wagons in continuous relay stood empty for longer stretches between trains. Warehouses built to hold cargo in transit held less of it, then nothing at all. The wharves along the water, the vaulted cellars under the stables, the timber yards stacked along the towpath, all of it emptied at roughly the same pace because all of it had been built to serve the same freight economy, and that economy no longer needed a site at the junction of a canal and a railway. An empty wharf, an empty vault, an empty yard. That was Camden by the middle of the 20th century, repeated block by block along the water, structure after structure standing with no cargo to hold and no clear use to replace it. Landlords who had once competed for tenants along the canal frontage now struggled to find any tenant at all, and rents fell in step with demand, until the district around the old depot became one of the cheapest stretches of inner London, property held cheaply because nobody could see what it was for. The roundhouse sat through these decades as Gilby's warehouse, gin barrels stored under a roof built for locomotives, one more building doing duty as storage for want of anything better to do. It had a canal nobody needed, and a rail yard nobody filled, and a set of buildings that had outlived the purpose they were built for. And by the 1960s, the whole district amounted to that condition and nothing more. Empty industrial shells, low rents, no plan. Into that condition, in 1966, the roundhouse reopened. Not as a warehouse and not as an engine shed, but as a venue, hosting overnight events for London's underground press and the new bands then working the city's fringes rather than its established stages. Nobody involved was trying to solve Camden's problem. They were using a cheap, disused building because it was cheap and disused and large enough to hold a crowd, the same qualities that had made every other structure along the canal worthless to a landlord looking for a tenant paying industrial rent. But the reopening demonstrated something the rest of Camden had not yet worked out about itself. A dead industrial building in this particular district could be worth more filled with people for a night than it had ever been, worth filled with cargo or gin barrels. The freight economy had priced the building at nothing. The first crowd through its doors priced it differently. The roundhouse was one building, reopened for one purpose, and its lessons stayed inside its own walls for 6 years. Then, on the same stretch of water, 2 childhood friends looked at a builder's yard with nothing left to sell in it, and saw something other than a dead end. Chapter 4. The Yard, the Hall, and the First Saturday. By 1972, the timber yard beside the lock belonged to a company called T.E. Dingwall, and it was the type of business the canal frontage still produced in those years, a going concern on paper and an empty one in practice. 2 childhood friends took it on that year. Bill Fulford and Peter Wheeler had grown up together in the streets around Camden, the type of friendship that survives school and jobs and comes back around when one of them needs a partner for something neither would attempt alone. What they bought was a builder's yard with sheds, a wharf frontage, and a stock ledger with almost nothing left to sell against it. The freight that had once justified a timber merchant on this stretch of water had thinned to a trickle years before, and Fulford and Wheeler had inherited the tail end of it. A business without customers is still a business. It is also, to 2 men who own the ground under it, an opportunity waiting for someone to name it. A year later, 20 yards along the same frontage, someone did. John Armitt was a wine merchant, the type of Londoner whose trade ran on evenings and other people's money, and by 1973 he had a partner in Tony Mackintosh and an idea for a derelict packaging warehouse sitting empty on the canal side. The building had spent its recent decades exactly the way most of Camden's waterside sheds had, stacked with crates, unheated, unvisited outside working hours. Armitt and Mackintosh gutted it and put in a stage, a bar and a dance floor, and by the end of 1973 it was open under a new name, Dingwall's Dance Hall, borrowed from the timber yard next door that had given the site its identity for 100 years before either man arrived. The music came first. Not the craft stalls, the antiques, or the row of tables that would define this ground in the public imagination for the next 50 years. but a hall with a sound system and a license to stay open late. Dingwalls opened its doors to bands and to the crowd that followed them, and for a season it ran on its own, a venue with a canal on one side and an idle timber yard on the other, drawing people to a corner of London that had given them no other reason to come. Fulford and Wheeler watched the crowd Armitt and Mackintosh were pulling in and did the only thing two men with an empty yard and a hall next door were likely to do. They opened the gates. On the 30th of March 1974, on a Saturday, the T.E. Dingwall yard held its first market. 16 stalls went up that morning, trestle tables and rented pitches selling handmade jewellery, second-hand clothes and furniture that had been salvaged rather than bought. There was no ribbon, no announcement beyond word passed along from the crowd already coming for the music next door. Camden Lock, as the traders and then everyone else began calling it, was a weekend market, and nothing more, open when the gates were open and empty the rest of the week. Nobody who ran a stall that first Saturday was told this would last. The opposite was true, and it was said to them plainly. The pitches were let on terms that assumed the whole arrangement was temporary, a use for a yard while its owners worked out what to do with it properly. And every trader who paid for a table understood the deal on those terms. Fulford and Wheeler were not building a market. They were filling dead ground with something that earned money on a Saturday, in a builder's yard that had nothing left to sell and no obvious future of its own. Why a builder's yard on a canal lock 20 minutes from central London had sat idle long enough for two friends to buy it for next to nothing, with nobody objecting, was a question the traders behind their tables that morning never raised. The answer was already sitting in a planning file at the council, and it had nothing to do with crafts, jewellery or a Saturday crowd. Chapter 5. The road that was never built. The planning file did not mention markets or stalls or a Saturday crowd drawn by a hall next door. It mentioned a road. By the early 1970s, London's planners had drawn a northern urban motorway across the map of the city, an eastward continuation of the Westway, and the line it followed ran straight through the ground beside the lock where Fulford and Wheeler had just taken possession of an empty timber yard. The road was not built. It never would be. But the plan alone did the work a finished motorway never had the chance to do. A scheme on a map behaves like a scheme already built, at least where property is concerned. No bank lends against a site earmarked for demolition. No developer commits capital to a building a compulsory purchase order might claim within the decade. No landlord repairs a roof the council's own drawings say will not exist in 10 years. The northern motorway sat on the plans through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, a line drawn across streets, wharves and yards that had not been told when the bulldozers were coming. Only that they were coming, eventually. Landlords along that line could not sell with confidence. Tenants could not build with confidence. The whole corridor was frozen in the particular way that only a road not yet built can freeze a district, worth less standing than it would have been worth demolished, because demolition at least comes with compensation. That was the condition Fulford and Wheeler had bought into in 1972, though condition understates it. The company they had registered to hold the lease, trading as Northside Developments, paid £10,000 for the final 7 years remaining on the Dingwall yard, and it was not a bargain in the ordinary sense. It was close to the ground's actual value under the circumstances, a fair price for land that had, on paper, 7 years left before the road came through or the lease expired, whichever arrived first. There was no third outcome on offer. Nobody selling that lease believed they were selling anything else, and nobody buying it expected to be handed more than the 7 years the blight had priced into the sale. 7 years was the horizon the blight allowed, and 7 years was what changed hands. The blight did not fall on the yard alone. It fell on the wharves either side of it, on the sheds along the towpath, on every structure standing inside the corridor the road was meant to follow, and it fell on all of them the same way, freezing rents and repairs, and any plan longer than the scheme itself was expected to last. A district can survive being poor. Poverty still permits investment at the right price. A district has more trouble surviving the prospect of being erased because erasure permits none. The objections started early and ran long, residents and amenity groups working the public inquiries the way such fights are always worked, through submission after submission, meeting after meeting, delay after delay. None of it moved quickly. The scheme was contested, revised, contested again, and by around 1976, it was shelved rather than cancelled outright, quietly dropped from the plans it had sat on for the better part of a decade. Nobody announced that a market beside a canal lock had just been handed the ground beneath it. The road was simply gone from the map, and Camden Lock was no longer a use for frozen land waiting on a bulldozer. It was the only tenant that had bothered to stay. By then, the 16 stalls of 1974 were not 16 anymore, and the traders who had been told their pitches were temporary had been trading long enough that temporary had quietly become a word. Nobody used out loud. The ground under Camden Lock was still cheap, the leases were still short, and the reason for both had just vanished from the file. What arrived instead, in the years right after the road disappeared from the map, was not a planning decision. It was a sound, carried up from the hall next door and out through the market gates, and within 2 years it would have a name. Chapter 6. The Clothes and the Noise. By 1976, the crowd on the canal frontage was no longer only a Saturday crowd looking for the odd second-hand table. Something had arrived in London that needed clothes nobody was selling on Oxford Street, and Camden Lock, without changing anything about how it operated, turned out to be already stocked for it. The stalls that had opened 2 years earlier for jewellery and salvaged furniture were run by traders who bought and altered and resold whatever came through, and what came through in 1976 and 1977 included leather jackets, ripped denim, safety pins, and second-hand clothing that a punk audience wanted precisely because it had not been designed for them. The market did not invent punk fashion. It supplied it, stocked already with exactly the raw material a new movement needed. 20 yards from the stalls, Dingwalls kept doing what it had done since 1973, putting bands in front of a crowd on a canal side that had no other reason to draw one. What changed after 1976 was the bill. The venue that had opened on jazz and pub rock nights was booking the acts driving the new sound out of London's small halls, and the crowd filling the room on those nights was drawn from the same postcode, the same trains, the same Saturday habit that already brought people to the market by day. A short walk up the road, the Electric Ballroom had been running as an Irish dance hall since the 1930s, a venue built for show bands and Sailey nights, serving a community that had used it for exactly that purpose for 4 decades. In the summer of 1978, it was renamed, and the booking changed with the name Sid Vicious. The Clash, Madness, and Joy, Division all played there within a handful of years. A hall that had spent 40 years hosting one type of Saturday night was, within a season, hosting an entirely different one, and it did so without moving an inch or altering anything about the building except what was written over the door. None of this required coordination. The market did not know it was clothing an audience for 2 venues it did not own, and the venues did not know they were drawing a crowd that would spend the afternoon buying from stalls they had no stake in. What connected them was distance, measured in yards rather than miles. A visitor could buy a jacket from a stall on the canal side in the afternoon and walk it, unworn until that evening, into a gig at Dingwalls or the Electric Ballroom a few hours later, without crossing a road that mattered, or spending a fare on a bus or a train. The clothes and the noise were being sold within sight of each other on the same weekend, to the same people, by businesses that had never signed an agreement to work together and did not need one. This is what a market and a set of venues sharing one small stretch of canal frontage do to each other when the timing lines up. The money that would have left the district to buy clothes elsewhere stayed on the block. The crowd that would have gone home after a Saturday of shopping stayed for the evening instead. The noise drew people who needed the clothes, and the clothes dressed the crowd the noise depended on, a loop that fed itself without either side keeping the books on the other. Neither the stalls nor the halls were built for this. Both benefited from it. The traders who had signed short leases in 1974 on ground nobody wanted were, by 1978, supplying the wardrobe for a movement with international reach, from trestle tables in a yard that had cost its owners almost nothing to acquire. By the early 1980s, the market had outgrown the yard entirely, and it began doing what a market on cheap, half-derelict ground generally does once demand exceeds the space available to meet it. It moved into whatever structure nearby had stopped being used for its original purpose. The horse tunnels under the stables came next, along with the vaults, and then every stretch of the canal frontage still standing empty, waiting for someone to find a use for it that had nothing to do with freight. Chapter 7. The Spread. By the early 1980s, Camden Lock was no longer a single yard beside a lock, and it had stopped being one for a simple reason. The market had run out of yard to sell from. What happened next was not expansion in the ordinary sense. It was migration into every structure nearby that had already been abandoned once and had nothing left to lose by being occupied again. The horse tunnels went first, the same brick arches cut in 1839 for 50 stalls and enlarged by 1849 into stabling for 427 animals, working the incline in relays. Traders carried rails and folding tables down into vaults where grooms had once slept between shifts, along ramps built to a gradient a cart horse could climb, and through arches sized for a stable door rather than a shop front. The tunnels that had moved goods off a railway a century earlier were, within a few seasons, moving denim, leather and second-hand vinyl instead. The brickwork did not need to change. It had been cut for weight and for numbers passing through it in relay, and a Saturday crowd was just another load to move. The horse hospital went next, built in the same period to treat animals lame by the cobbles and the incline, and standing derelict since the last horse left the yard, followed by the vaults under the old goods shed, and the timber jetties and canal sheds that had waited empty since the wharves stopped moving cargo. Every one of these structures carried the same history underneath it. Raised for one animal or one machine, emptied when that economy ended, left standing because pulling it down cost more than ignoring it did. The market did not choose them for their character, it chose them because the rent was low enough to survive a bad Saturday. What arrived on the weekends by the middle of the decade was no longer a crowd shopping for jewellery and salvaged furniture. It was a pilgrimage. Coaches came up from the south coast on a Saturday morning. Trains from the Midlands and the North emptied onto the platform at Camden town and walked the same half-mile everyone else walked, past the lock, past Dingwalls, down into tunnels where the stalls now ran 3 and 4 deep. The bridge over the canal became one of the recognised bottlenecks of a London weekend, a line of people waiting to cross water that had once carried barges and now carried nothing but the reflection of the crowd standing on it. Somewhere in that decade, Camden stopped being a place and became a word. Music papers photographed the stalls the way they photographed the bands, and the clothes worn on an album sleeve that month could usually be traced, thread by thread, back to a rail in the stables or a table by the canal. A jacket bought on a Saturday afternoon showed up on a stage the following weekend, then on a record cover the month after, then on a rack hundreds of miles from the lock, sold as an approximation of something that had only ever existed at full strength in one postcode. Camden did not advertise for this. It supplied a look faster and cheaper than anyone else could manufacture one, and the magazines did the rest of the work for free. Underneath the crowds and the coverage, the arrangement holding the market together had not changed since 1974. The rent was still low. The leases were still short, most running year to year or less. Renewed on terms a trader could recite from memory because nothing about them had ever needed writing down twice. And the people behind the tables were still, for the most part, much the same people who had opened the first 16 stalls. Makers and menders and dealers who cut the leather or dyed the denim or pressed the records they sold, rather than middlemen moving stock somebody else had produced. Low rent and short leases had built the market. Neither one was written with the crowds of the next 3 decades in mind. By the end of the 1980s, the coaches were still arriving, the tunnels were still full, and a sound with a different name was already forming in a pub up the road. Chapter 8. The Office on Inverness Street. By the early 1990s, the sound coming out of London had a postcode, and the postcode was Camden's. A new generation of bands built their names in the venues along the canal, in the pubs a few streets back, in rehearsal rooms above shops that had been selling second-hand clothes since before most of the musicians were born. Britpop did not choose Camden the way a label chooses a location for a photo shoot. It settled there because the infrastructure already existed, cheap rehearsal space, venues that would book an unknown act on a Tuesday, and a market that had spent 2 decades proving it could dress whatever subculture walked through its gates. Camden became the working address of British music, not a backdrop for it, but the actual place where the songs got written, argued over and played first, in front of an audience that could walk home afterward. Dingwalls and the Electric Ballroom, the 2 halls that had staged punk 2 decades earlier, booked the new acts on the same stages, to a crowd that had swapped safety pins for parkas and still bought its wardrobe from the same stalls a short walk from the door. The Good Mixer, an unremarkable pub on Inverness Street, became that address's unofficial office. It was not built for the role. It had no stage, no sound system, no booking agent, nothing a venue needs to matter to a music scene. What it had was proximity. and hours that matched the schedules of people who worked at night and slept through the mornings. Members of Blur drank there. So did the acts competing with them for the same audience, the same magazine covers, the same chart positions. The market traders who supplied the clothes worn on those covers drank there too, often at the same tables, closing the same loop that had connected the stalls to the venues 15 years earlier during punk. Musicians, traders and journalists occupied the same handful of square feet, and the pub did not need to advertise any of it. What Camden was selling by the 1990s was not a product a competitor could copy by opening a similar market somewhere cheaper. A market can be replicated. A pub can be replicated. What cannot be replicated is the accumulated fact of a place having been where things already happened repeatedly for 2 decades until the reputation became self-sustaining. Bands moved there because bands were already there, magazines covered it because the coverage already existed, and the pull on visitors ran on nothing more complicated than a scene that kept existing partly because people kept arriving to look for it. No planning department manufactures that condition. No developer commissions it. It accretes, one dressed-up Saturday night at a time, and by the point anyone tries to bottle it, the thing that made it work has usually already moved somewhere else. It moved a short distance north at the turn of the millennium, from Inverness Street to the Hawley Arms, a pub that took over the role the Good Mixer had played through the previous decade. A new set of regulars filled it, among them Amy Winehouse and Pete Doherty, musicians building their own reputations the way the previous generation had built theirs, in this pub, on these streets, alongside the same traders who had never stopped supplying the clothes. The mechanism had not changed since 1976. What changed was the audience watching it happen. Camden's cultural currency reached its highest point in these years, the exact years in which the neighbourhood's value as real estate began to attract the attention of people who had never bought a drink in the Good Mixer or a jacket off a stall on the canal side, people who knew the postcode only from magazine profiles and were about to start valuing it in pounds per square foot instead. That valuation was already underway, quietly, in offices nowhere near Inverness Street. The crowd still counted in the millions each year, and by the end of the decade someone would put a precise figure on how many. The traders still counted in the hundreds, and by the end of the decade someone would put a precise figure on how much of the money those millions spent ever reached them. Chapter 9. Who owns the ground? By the end of the 2000s, the precise figure had arrived. The market complex spun out from that one derelict builder's yard in 1974 was drawing something close to 28 million visitors a year, a number that put it behind only a handful of destinations in London and ahead of institutions with royal charters and centuries of marketing behind them. 28 million people walking through tunnels cut for cart horses, past stalls in a horse hospital, across a bridge built for barge traffic that no longer moved anything but foot crossings, arriving for a market that still looked, on paper, like the market that had opened with 16 stalls and no 5-year plan. It was not the same market, not anymore, not in the way that mattered. What had opened in 1974 as a single yard under one informal arrangement was now several markets, standing on adjoining ground, each with its own landlord and its own rent book. Camden Lock, the original yard by the water, answered to one owner. The stables, the horse tunnels and the vaults beneath them to another. Buck Street, the strip of stalls nearest the tube station, to a third, and the canal side frontage to a fourth. A visitor crossing from one section to the next, buying a jacket at one stall and a record at the next, was moving between 4 separate businesses, none of whose owners had been in the room in 1974, none of whom had built anything the visitor had come to see. This was the arrangement that had been assembling itself quietly for 3 decades since the first coaches came up from the south coast and the first magazine photographed a jacket bought off a rail in the stables. Low rent had built the market. Short leases had kept it flexible in the years when the tunnels were full and the sound coming out of Camden had a postcode. But the same flexibility that let a trader open a stall on short notice also let a landlord close one on short notice, once the ground under it had acquired a value the trader had no part in setting. The economics inverted without anyone announcing it. The crowd came for the traders, for the mix of leather and vinyl and second-hand denim, and the smell of the food stalls by the lock, a mix no chain store had managed to replicate and no property company had managed to build from nothing. But the crowd did not pay the trader for the privilege of standing on that ground. It paid the trader for a jacket, and the trader paid the landlord for the ground, and the landlord's asset rose in value. Every year the crowd kept coming, whether or not the trader who had drawn that crowd was still the one paying rent on the pitch. A market stall on a short lease is, from the landlord's side of the ledger, a tenant improving a permanent asset at the tenant's own expense. The mechanism was straightforward, once it was visible. A trader arrived with nothing, found a cheap pitch in a derelict tunnel and built a following over years of Saturdays, and in doing so made that stretch of brick and cobble worth more than it had been the week before. The following belonged to the trader. The value it created belonged to the landlord. When the lease came up for renewal, the rent could be set against what the pitch was now worth to anyone at all, not against what it had cost the trader to build that worth in the first place. A trader who had turned a forgotten stable block into a destination could find that pitch priced against a chain retailer, bidding for the same square footage, and the chain retailer selling in Camden the same merchandise it sold in 40 other cities. Did not need the trader's following to make the rent. It only needed the crowd already standing outside the door. 28 million people a year were still coming to watch traders build something out of nothing, the way traders had been doing it since 1974. The ground beneath them had stopped being nothing a long time ago. In February of 2008, it would start to burn. Chapter 10. The Holy Arms. On the 9th of February 2008, in the hours after the market had shut for the night, a fire broke out among the stalls at Camden Lock. It moved through timber frames, canvas awnings and packed merchandise faster than the first crews could contain it, and within the hour more than 100 firefighters were working the site with flames rising 30 feet above the canal, lighting the water red for the length of the lock. Residents on the surrounding streets were evacuated while crews fought to keep the fire from spreading toward the stables and the railway arches beyond. The blaze burned through the night and into the following morning before it was brought under control. When the smoke cleared, entire rows of stalls were gone, reduced to the black wet debris that takes weeks to clear rather than days. The canal, which had carried barges and then nothing for a century, now carried ash on its surface. The Holy Arms burned with them. It was not one loss among many that night. It was the pub that had taken over from the Good Mixer as the room where the scene gathered, the address Amy Winehouse and Pete Doherty had made their own at the turn of the decade, gutted in the same hours as the stalls around it. The fire took the stalls that traders had built pitch by pitch over decades. It took the stock inside them, the leather and the vinyl and the handmade jewellery that could not be replaced by mourning. It took, in the Holy Arms, the one building on the site whose name needed no further explanation. The timing carried its own arithmetic and answered to nobody. Camden's music was, in February 2008, more visible around the world than at any point since punk, its name attached to records selling on continents that had never heard of Dingwalls or the Electric Ballroom. The fire did not wait for a quiet year to arrive. It arrived at the peak in the same ground that was producing the reputation, and it did so without any regard for what the ground happened to be worth to anyone standing on it that week. What burned was rebuilt. Who rebuilt it was a separate question. Rebuilding a burned stall required capital before it required a pitch, and the traders who had lost stock and structures that night did not, in every case, have the capital sitting ready. The traders who lost their pitches that night were, for the most part, not the traders who reopened once the site had been cleared. In July 2011, Amy Winehouse died at 27 at her home in Camden. Almost overnight, the district acquired a memorial trail. Walking tours began routing visitors past the addresses where she had lived and performed, past the Holy Arms itself, rebuilt and trading again by then under new ownership, its name unchanged, and its fire nowhere on the sign. A statue followed in 2014, a fixed point for visitors to photograph on streets that had, 3 years earlier, simply been streets people lived on. Camden had spent 4 decades selling clothes, records, and a version of itself that changed with whatever scene was currently filling its pubs. It now had something else to sell, its own past, packaged for people who had arrived looking for a moment that had already ended before they got there. The market that once dressed the bands standing at the bar now sold postcards of the bar itself, and the postcards sold at a steadier margin than the clothes ever had. The rebuilding after the fire had already shown what the ground was worth to people who had never worked a pitch on it. The years after 2011 confirmed it. A site that made its name through traders who lived on short leases and low rent was, by the middle of the decade, a name valuable enough on its own to attract buyers who had never needed to set foot in the stables to know what Camden was worth. The buyer arrived within 3 years of the statue. Chapter 11. The Inventory. The buyer was Teddy Sagi, the Israeli founder of the gambling software company Playtech, and in 2014 he bought the stables market for £400 million, in partnership with the restaurateur Richard Caring. He did not stop there. Within the same period, he bought Camden Lock Market as well, for a sum reported at somewhere between £70 and £90 million. What Sagi assembled was not a lease. It was the ground itself, and the ground now belonged to one man's holding company, rather than to the hundreds of traders who had spent 4 decades making it worth owning. In July of 2017, fire returned to Camden Lock. It moved through the stalls along the canal the way the 2008 fire had moved through them, and roughly 70 firefighters worked the waterfront through the night to bring it under control. A market that had already learned this lesson once learned it again. Every fire clears ground, and cleared ground gets rebuilt to a specification and a rent that the fire itself had no part in setting. The stalls that burned in 2008 came back as stalls, patched and reopened by traders scraping together the capital to return. What came back after 2017 came back as something else entirely. The rebuild that followed was not a market repair, it was a property development, and it looked like one. The Hawley Wharf scheme rose along the canal in glass and steel, with retail units built to a shopfront specification a market stall was never designed to meet. The Buck Street Market was rebuilt as a stack of shipping containers, uniform, branded, photographable. Reporting on the new schemes noted footfall considerably lower than the small independent traders they had displaced ever generated on the same ground. The units were priced for companies with a marketing budget and a head office, not for a stall holder working a weekend lease. Chains were what the new rents could support, and chains moved in. The estate today collects roughly £72 million a year in rent from the traders standing on it. In 2025, it was put up for sale as a single lot, priced at approximately £1.5 billion, marketed not as a market at all, but as an income stream, a schedule of rents attached to a postcode. Whoever bought it would not be buying stalls, a canal, or a crowd. They would be buying a number the crowd generates every week without being paid for generating it. The traders left on site describe the same cycle in the same words, regardless of which owner's name is on the current lease. The pitch fee rises, the lease runs short, a year or two at most, rarely longer. And somewhere behind every renewal sits the understanding that the landlord can always find someone selling souvenirs willing to pay more for the same square footage than a trader selling something they made themselves. Visitor reviews now complain that every unit along the main run sells the same tourist merchandise: keyrings, t-shirts, phone cases. That complaint is the precise inversion of the reason anyone first came to Camden. The crowd arrived for the thing the rent structure now makes hardest to sell. Inverness Street once ran a working food market. Fruit and vegetables and fish sold to people who lived in Camden and needed groceries rather than souvenirs. It has been reduced to a short row of stalls selling the same trinkets found everywhere else on the site. Camden Council continues to publish strategies for markets and street trading years into the future, the way a council keeps publishing plans for a thing it no longer fully controls. And underneath all of it, the arithmetic runs one direction only. The music infrastructure that built Camden's name in the first place is the least profitable use of the land it occupies. A venue survives on the margin of a door ticket, minus the band, minus the sound engineer, minus the night's insurance. A retail unit the same size earns a landlord fixed rent, paid monthly, with no band and no door and no risk. The Electric Ballroom pays its rent one ticket at a time. The unit next door pays it in a single transfer. What is left walking the site today is an inventory rather than a story. The double lock still stands where the canal climbs toward Camden Town, its gates closing and opening on schedule, lifting nothing but the occasional narrowboat run for tourists rather than the coal and timber it was built to move. The horse tunnels beneath the stables, cut into the hillside for the depot's working horses, are hung now with clothing rails, the hoofprints in the old cobbles worn smoother by trainers than they ever were by hooves. The roundhouse still stands over a district it was built to service, an engine shed with no engines in it, staging concerts instead of turning locomotives. The Hawley Arms, twice burned in one sense or another, rebuilt and open, its name unchanged on the sign. And the market that once changed hands for £10,000, the price of the final 7 years on a builder's yard nobody else wanted, is now valued whole at £1.5 billion. 27 million people a year walk through the gates of a place built, stall by traders who could not afford to rent a pitch on it now.